Now, prior to UFC buying Pride, which organization did you like working for better?
I loved working for Pride at the time because there was definitely an understanding of the sport was a lot better for Pride, meaning that the fans were a lot more educated. The fans were, they loved the sport a lot better. It was something that they were accustomed to, whether there was the sumo wrestling or they had K1. They understood the sport a lot better, but it only took a matter of time before the Americans learned the sport. I remember, when I fought and won the World Championships from Randy Couture, there was, we were selling about 60,000 pay-per-view buys. It was only a matter of time before, it started getting to the, it started to explode and people really caught on to what submission wrestling was and what chokes and arm bars were. It took some time. I remember working for the UFC and trying to educate the fans and the press what the sport was and what it is today. It took a long time to get to where it is now. I loved working for Pride a lot better. It was a bigger fan base. We were filling out stadiums that were baseball stadiums that were like at least 75,000 plus people. In the States, we were lucky if we got 13 or 10,000 at the time.
Now, was it better to fight in a ring or a cage?
At the time, my preference was to fight in a cage because, being such a wrestler and a grappler, it was easier to take opponents down. My philosophy on the ring was it was a lot classier. I always thought it looked a little bit nicer. We got a better view, but to me, I always thought the cage was a little bit safer, so no one fell out the ring and so forth.
Yeah.
But it was 20 meters by 20 meters for the Pride ring, and the UFC cage was, I think, 36, a centimeter, I believe. I'm not sure exactly, but it was, the cage was bigger, but I remember the Pride just being so much more classy.
Okay.
It was a really nice setup, the way they did things.
Now, before a fight, do you have any pregame rituals?
Yeah, I mean, you always, when you're getting ready for an event, you try to, keep the same training. You try to train all the way up to the event. You try to eat your meals. I'm always a church guy, so I'll always go to church, light candles before fights, and try to, just stay really focused and, just keep the same routine, like I said, with the nutrition and training. And, just stay nice and relaxed and, go to church and just praying. That's my own personal preference of what I do before an event.
Can you run me through injuries? Because I know, obviously, in mixed martial artists, you're injured a lot, and you fight while you're injured.
Yeah, I mean, being injured is, it's part of the game. I've had 7 knee surgeries. I've had my right ACL. I've had 4 meniscus repairs on my right side, so that's 5. Then I've had 2 meniscus repairs on my left knee. I've had I've reattached a tendon that came out of my right elbow. They reattached the right tendon. They've taken out bone chips out of my right elbow. My right shoulder had a rotator cuff repair and a labrum repair, and I broke, both my hands, and just repaired them with, letting them heal naturally and taking the bone chips out.
Okay, that seems like a lot. Is it really worth it?
When you love something you do, and
Okay.
at the end of the day, I've had everything bruised from shins to tore my ankles, and it's just part of the game. I mean, something I love to do. It's a sport that I picked and just kind of fell into, but at the end I really had a lot of passion for. I'm 32 years old. I have a lot of injuries, but I have 48 professional fights. And that's a lot for someone my age, and I love it. I wouldn't trade it. That's for sure.
I know that you fought Randy Couture for the UFC World Heavyweight Championship. Was that your biggest fight, or was there another?
That was my biggest accomplishment, UFC 39, fighting for Randy Couture. At the time, I was only like 9-1, and defeating Randy Couture was one of the biggest accomplishments because it was something that I really focused really hard on, and it really became a goal of mine to achieve that type of success. And for me, fighting for the UFC was the biggest part of my life. It'd be just as big as winning an NFL championships or an NBA championships. That I've reached the climax, and winning something like that, over a guy like Randy Couture for a vacant title, was huge for me because he's one of the best athletes in the world. Still is today.
Yes. Something that I found very ironic was when Randy Couture was training for your fight, he was training with Tim Sylvia. He beat you for the title. I just thought that was very ironic with that. You also fought Antonio Nogueira, so you fought some big name people during your career.
Yeah, I mean, when he trained for Tim Sylvia, I believe Tim Sylvia was one of the up and coming guys, and Randy Couture's camp didn't have the appropriate heavyweights. It was bigger than Randy was, and he had just lost to Josh Barnett, so he needed to get someone in there some size. And to be honest with you, I think him training with Tim Sylvia helped him to beat Tim Sylvia later on when they fought. And then me losing to Tim Sylvia, it's just I always say that there's A beats B and B beats C and C loses to A. It's just a weird triangle sometimes how things work. Just like in wrestling matches or jiu-jitsu matches, and sometimes it just happens. Styles make matches. I have fought pretty much everyone there is to fight in the mixed martial arts. I fought everybody from Randy Couture, Jeff Munson, Arlovsky. I fought Kiyoshi Kasaka. There's so many guys I fought that were named guys, people. Antonio Silva. That's part of the game, is just fighting all the best guys and hopefully trying to go out there and just compete at the top level. Sometimes it doesn't happen the way you plan to, but go back to the drawing board and hopefully you can do better. That's the best I can do.
What was your hardest fight?
The hardest fight, I think, would probably be the Arlovsky fight in 2001 when I came from Pride and the rules were a lot different. There was we were allowed to knee opponents on the ground. We were allowed to foot stomp opponents. We were allowed to kick opponents when they were down. And then when you came to the UFC, you were allowed to use elbows. You weren't allowed to use elbows in Pride. So there was that moment that you crossed over, and it was really difficult to really get it done. So there was that moment that I had that it was kind of hard. And to be honest with you, Arlovsky at the time was a really tough opponent. Even though I beat him, I remember getting hit the hardest with Arlovsky.
You won that fight too by referee stoppage.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
Do you
sometimes you win them, but sometimes you feel like you still came out a little beat up, and that was one of them.
Do you have a dream fight of anybody in the world that you'd want to fight?
I always would love to go back and fight some of the guys I lost to. Whether it's I'd like to rematch against Nogueira. I beat Nogueira in Abu Dhabi. I submitted him in 2001, and then we fought in 2000. I think we fought in 2004, and I lost the decision. So I'd like to see a rematch against Nogueira. I'd like my dream fight would probably be to fight Randy Couture at 205. There's still a lot of fights out there left, to go out there and fight. It's just a matter of time of where I feel like going. My biggest goal right now is probably dropping down from heavyweight going into light heavyweight. Yeah. That's my biggest goal right now.